96.5 FM, WWDB, the talk station.
Hi, this is Bernie Herman. Good to have you with us tonight, Monday night. Ripping off the federal government has been considered good hunting by the rippers for years. And the rippees, the government that writes the checks, either didn't seem to care or were taking several long winter's naps. Finally, the government decided to go after the defense industry. A series of sensational trials, guilty verdicts, and huge civil settlements has riveted an industry that was once scandalized by $600 hammers and $15,000 toilet seats. Today, the defense industry is at the forefront of practical and meaningful compliance programs, and they've developed programs in which they can police themselves. Now the government is zeroing in on its next mission, cleaning up the healthcare industry. After defense, healthcare is the single largest segment of the national economy. And according to the U.S. General Accounting Office, the GAO, healthcare spending was estimated at $700 billion in 1991. And it's also estimated that up to 10% of all healthcare claims are fraudulent. So we're going to take a look at the flagrant and systematic fraud that permeates the healthcare industry and fully examine a federal provision which allows private citizens who find evidence of fraud against the government to blow the whistle against the perpetrators. And we'll find out what is being done to combat healthcare fraud, specific examples of that fraud, and the disposition of some of the cases that have been brought against those who ripped off the government and, of course, the taxpayers as well. And my guest will be Mark S. Responti, a specialist on the prosecution and defense of criminal and civil fraud cases. And I'll return with Mr. Responti in a moment. Now we'll take calls. This is Bernie Herman. Tonight's topic is combating healthcare fraud and blowing the whistle. My guest is Mark Responti. Mark, good to have you with us.
Good evening, Bernie.
Name of your firm is?
Miller, Alfano, and Responti.
And the areas of interest and expertise, the background about the firm, what is it you do?
Sure. The firm was started about 6 years ago. We broke off from a larger firm. The principals are all former state and federal prosecutors. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, we were doing a lot of, and still do, white-collar criminal defense. We branched out into some commercial litigation, which we still do.
What's commercial litigation?
Commercial litigation is basically two companies fighting over some money. That's the easiest way to define commercial litigation. Mm-hmm. We also have a significant reinsurance practice, and we will represent regulators and other companies in the insurance area.
Okay. So those are the things that you do.
Mm-hmm.
And litigation of the Federal False Claims Act, which we'll talk about tonight, obviously.
Sure.
Okay. Let's go over some of the ground that I touched upon in my opening tonight, Mark. How big in terms of dollars is the healthcare industry today?
The healthcare industry, next to the defense industry, is the second largest expenditure of federal funds in the United States. In 1991, the statistics from the General Accounting Office were about $700 billion. Mm-hmm. I checked about 2 weeks ago to see the best statistics that were being released by the government. It's up anywhere from $800 to $900 billion.
So it's even more than it was when you wrote the paper.
That's correct.
Yeah. And what chunk of money is stolen by at least a few greedy providers?
There's no way to determine with precision the exact amount of money that is false or fraudulent. There have been all kinds of studies that have been conducted over the years, but anywhere from conservatively 10% to I've seen some studies as high as 20%. So it can be as high as $100 billion that are being stolen.
Right, and who is being ripped off most of the time?
Well, the people who are being ripped off most of the time ultimately are the taxpayers, but the Medicare system for the most part.
Medicare.
And Medicaid would be the second largest program that's being hit. Social Security obviously would be up there too.
Do they sometimes hit private insurance companies?
Many, many times.
They do, yeah.
Yes.
Who are the healthcare providers that we are talking about tonight?
Well, healthcare providers are very broad. It covers a broad range of individuals, but it's anywhere from a hospital, a doctor, a physician, a chiropractor, a durable medical equipment supplier, a manufacturer of pharmaceutical, anyone who provides materials or services that would be used in the healthcare industry.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the common types of fraud among healthcare providers?
The most common type of fraud, and traditionally the type of fraud that the government had initially gone after, are people who charge the government for services that are never provided. For example, a doctor that checks off a box that perhaps for a $180 test for a test he never performed. A durable medical equipment company that sells a collar or a cane that might cost $2 that are billed to the Medicare system for $2,000.
Oh,
there are hundreds and hundreds of examples, but that's the more basic fraud that goes on.
In reading about it, it talked about improperly billing Medicare for thousands of unnecessary office visits. To me, that would be kind of tough to prove, wouldn't it? I mean, billing someone a couple $1,000s for a $2 item, that's different. That should be an easy one.
Well, Bernie, the difficulty...
How do you prove that?
That's the interesting. The difficulty in proving it is what kept the government away from healthcare providers for a long, long time. I don't think there were any significant prosecutions until the late 70s, early 80s. There was a case prosecuted against a local doctor, Dr. Grieber, in the early 1980s, and it was the first significant case to move forward against a doctor in a major federal case. After that case, the government started to think that they could prove some of these frauds, and they have been increasing the prosecutions ever since then.
I've seen, I've talked to people who've taken a look at, for example, a hospital bill, and they'll say, I never had that. I never had that equipment, or I didn't have that test. In one case, I think they charged someone for rehab, physical rehab. They'd never been down to the gym.
Well, I get a lot of calls on hospital bills.
Now, why do they do that?
Yeah, particularly from senior citizens who tend to really study their bills and are very concerned about them. About half the time, they did have the services, in all honesty, to the providers. They didn't know about it. They didn't remember. They didn't understand the person that came in. But there are increasing number of instances where people are billing for services they never did. Doctors are coming in and billing somebody for an hour. There are a number of, in the psychiatry area, there are a number of prosecutions that have gone on recently having to do with what is the psychiatric hour and what should it be reimbursed at. Many times psychiatrists will check a box for reimbursement for the psychiatric hour is actually about 50 minutes now, Bernie. And they may have only spent a few minutes with the patient, yet Medicare is reimbursing them at least until they catch the person for the full hour. So in the past, it had been very difficult, and that's what makes these cases kind of interesting, because they are difficult to find.
Difficult to find, yes, yeah. See, I'm always inclined not to make an accusation against a healthcare provider unless, it hits me right between the eyes. There's something going on here. I would hate to get any of these people in trouble because I misunderstood something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You also mentioned, now you wrote this paper, which was fascinating. This appeared in the Philadelphia Lawyer, and I think it was the spring issue, am I right?
That's correct.
On the cover it said, "Healthcare Fraud, the Government's Next Campaign," and inside is the article written by you.
That's correct.
"Healthcare Fraud, the Government's Next Campaign," by Mark S. Responti. And it mentioned some of the cases. One was a pharmacy which paid cash for prescriptions that never were filled. Now, does that mean the pharmacist paid a doctor for a prescription blanks?
That's correct.
A whole roll of these blanks?
That's correct.
And then they would have the prescription filled out, or they would fill it out themselves?
They would fill it out themselves.
Send it to Medicaid. Medicaid would send the money, but you said it was an unfilled prescription, which means they never filled that for any patient.
The pill stayed on the shelves.
Pill stayed on the shelves. It was for more than $3.5 million. That's a lot of pills.
That's correct.
How did they finally catch this guy?
On that particular case, it was an undercover audit done by the government, and the government has what they call walk-in rights. At any time when a provider is billing Medicaid or Medicare, they can walk in at any time and take a look at the books and records of the provider. It actually was going on for about 4 years before anyone actually caught it.
Well, how did they catch it? What was the...
They walked in and happened to see a copy of the prescription pad that did not jive any of the practice groups that were using that particular pharmacy. The pharmacy was in an area that serviced a number of providers.
And so they have an educated eye to look for certain things.
Yeah, they're fraud auditors, and they did a good job in finding that.
Yeah. Would it be a little like shoppers who shop in a department store, and what they're really shopping, of course, are the people who are the sales or account executives who are behind the counter.
That's correct.
To see whether or not they're doing the paperwork properly or pocketing the money.
Well, the credit card companies have become very sophisticated at detecting fraud, and if you've ever had a situation where your card has been stolen, they're pretty good at getting it back when they see a pattern that doesn't follow yours.
What makes healthcare fraud, Mark, so pervasive?
That's a complicated question.
See, I know it isn't my doctor. It's not my pharmacist that's doing these dastardly things. It isn't my hospital that I go to all the time. But stealing and ripping off the government, the taxpayers, as I said in the opening tonight, is considered to be fair game for some people. And 10% of 800, 900, what is it? 900
billion
right, is a lot of millions. So,
I think the reason why it's so pervasive is two reasons. Number one is that for the longest time, no one would touch a relatively sacrosanct industry because, your doctor, your pharmacist, your healthcare provider was not somebody that you would turn on or look at.
And held in the highest regard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As people started to look at doctors and lawyers, quite frankly, and congressmen and other people who had been held in high regard.
And talk show hosts.
I think the real reason is that the relative amounts are small, Bernie. Unlike a defense contractor who might be building a missile system for $800 or $900 million, a healthcare provider is defrauding the government in small chunks, $100 at a time, $50 at a time, $18 at a time, which doesn't mean much in a given day, but over the course of months and years, it amounts to millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah. And the reimbursement can be easily abused.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because there's a certain amount of trust to begin with that's there.
There's a certain amount of trust. There is Medicare and Medicaid are huge bureaucracies, and while they do the best job they can, there is a certain amount of trust, and the trust really comes down to the forms that the Medicare providers fill out. And on those forms, they certify that they are submitting accurate bills or claims for payment. And you have to be able to rely on something, and for the longest time, the government did rely on that.
Also, there are not enough people to go around and check on all the healthcare providers.
Absolutely not.
What happened to facilitate fraud? What made it easier to do? Were there certain changes in technology? Some
people feel that that fraud became easier with the onset of the computers.
Why did that make it easier?
Well, in the 1960s and 70s, everything was written, everything was longhand, and it took a lot of effort to submit things to the government. Nowadays, electronic billing has been in place.
What is that?
Which basically means that you don't have to submit a written form now to the government. If you set up an electronic billing system, and it can be anywhere from a small pharmacy to a giant healthcare provider, you might have 2 million claims being submitted a week with computer speaking to computer, with no human looking at that.
There used to be a paper trail.
Absolutely,
now that's gone.
There is no paper trail now.
So what it's done is, as you said, it's transformed the fraudulent claim into a few data processing keystrokes.
That's right.
That's it.
And which makes it very, very, very difficult without the assistance of somebody on the inside to really come forward and put it all together.
What degrees of success, Mark, has the federal government had in launching criminal prosecutions against healthcare abusers?
Criminal prosecutions against healthcare abusers have been on the rise over the last 10 years or so. I don't have the exact statistics, but I bet you in 1970 there were probably no criminal prosecutions brought. In 1980 there might have been a half a dozen. From 1990 on, there are hundreds and thousands of criminal prosecutions being brought across the country, mostly because a number of reasons. Number one, I think the government sees that there is a lot of fraud going on. The new administration, as did the old administration, has made healthcare fraud a priority. Attorney General Reno has made it the number 2 priority next to violent crime in the United States. And a lot of the traditional law enforcement tools are now being used against the healthcare fraud industry. The FBI, for example, is being decommissioned on bank robberies and placed on healthcare fraud areas. Internal surveillance, for example, is being now used against healthcare providers and scrupulous healthcare providers. So it is always a reapportionment of the government's resources, and to the extent that the defense industry, to a great extent, have been pounded in the 70s and early 80s, now the healthcare industry is receiving a lot of the concentration.
You know, I thought, I don't mean to sidetrack here, but I thought that one of the things that promoted the interest in healthcare reform were primarily the costs, exploding in some cases exponentially. I mean, I thought that from the very beginning when Senator Wofford ran a successful campaign 2 years ago, that what people were most concerned about was not the quality of healthcare, but the cost of it. Now, how much was fraud responsible for spiking those costs upward?
Well, again, it is impossible to directly
correlate.
Now,
you said 10% of $900 billion. And, you know, you tell me a couple hundred, I can visualize that. When we're getting into the billions now, it's hard for me. But I mean, in terms of the impact on the consumer's pocketbook and the rest, what does fraud really cost?
It has a significant impact, and it's funny. The threat of healthcare reform has started to bring down some of the costs. In fact, inflation, by some of the statistics I've read, are starting to come into check. But one of the other reasons it's starting to come into check is that the government is looking very, very carefully. And while healthcare fraud under the Civil False Claims Act, which is really the primary vehicle that the government has to recover money, you mentioned earlier private insurers, and private insurers are being ripped off to millions and millions of dollars, and many of those insurers are now putting aggressive anti-fraud campaigns. They're hiring a lot of ex-FBI agents and ex-prosecutors who are now assisting those companies in making sure that they are not being ripped off, which affects all of the premiums that we all pay.
Right. Some of the statutes used against those who commit fraud, federal mail fraud. I always see mail fraud. Does it mean that it has to go through the mail for it to become fraud? Is that the idea?
Well, the mails are one part of the mail fraud statute. You can also use the phone. You can use a fax machine.
What's wire fraud?
Wire fraud is a telephone and to some degree fax machines.
Okay.
The mail fraud happens to be one of the easiest criminal statutes to use, because basically if you put something into the mail and you know it's false or fraudulent,
right away
you have mail fraud.
Yeah.
It's an unparalleled.
They're even using RICO, aren't they?
RICO is being used, although RICO has fallen by the wayside to some degree because of the increased usage of the False Claims Act.
Anti-kickback and bribery statutes, and as well as violations of the Internal Revenue Code. And I'm assuming now that means that the healthcare provider doesn't report this as income.
It's funny, the IRS is getting more and more involved. In fact, after my article was published, the first call I got the day it was published were from 2 IRS agents who had been thinking about how the IRS could get more involved and had asked me to come and speak to some of their agents. But the IRS is getting more and more involved because wherever there's money that comes from the government, sometimes there's money that's not reported on tax returns.
Yes, something the government is desperately short of, as we all know.
Absolutely.
What is the effect of a criminal conviction on a provider?
A criminal conviction on a provider can really be a death knell to a provider, and for a number of reasons. Let's take an individual or a corporation. It wouldn't make any difference. Not only does an individual have criminal exposure and liability, in the case of the criminal statute, that means jail. And since the onset of the federal sentencing guidelines, people are going to jail. In fact, more and more they're going to jail. In addition to going to jail for periods of time, that provider, if convicted, the moment he or she is convicted, can no longer bill the healthcare system. So for a minimum of 5 years, that particular doctor or hospital cannot bill the healthcare system.
Is that right?
And to the extent that you have a doctor or hospital 90% or 100% dependent on Medicare funds, you can see how devastating that would be.
Sure.
Lastly, the provider who is convicted, in addition to criminal penalties and fines, often has to settle with the government with civil penalties and fines, which can be astronomical.
And there's a chance they may lose their license as
Absolutely.
well. Right? And you wonder why they would want to do it for the
That's
few
right.
extra bucks.
That's right.
Well, you wrote that a provider who learns that the government, after investigation, has declined criminal prosecution may not escape punishment if the government files a civil suit against the healthcare provider under the False Claims Act. What is the historical background of the Federal False Claims Act?
People think that fraud is a 20th century phenomenon.
It is not.
The False Claims Act was actually passed under the Lincoln administration. It was the last significant piece of legislation that he passed, and Lincoln was troubled at the fraud that was visited upon the Union Army.
What kind of fraud?
Well, there was a lot of, I was reading the statutory references to the original statute, but for example, horses that were diseased were being sold to the Union Army.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there's a famous tale at the Battle of Gettysburg, where 6 or 7 horses, apparently where some major generals or majors were on, didn't make it to the second day of the battle, and it wasn't because of a gunshot wound. Mm-hmm. Cannonballs would explode sometimes prematurely in the breech of a gun because they weren't properly performed. Food that should have been good food that the Union soldiers needed would be tainted. And this was going on and on. Many profiteers made exorbitant amounts of money on the money that was going around in the Union Army. So Lincoln was concerned about it. And I was able to go back to the 1863. I was the 37th Congress, and there was a famous line that was said that basically to catch a rogue, you needed a rogue. And that was what Lincoln decided to do when he added the qui tam provisions to the statute.
Mm-hmm.
But it started in 1863, was very active for many years. It died out right after the war because Congress started to amend and re-amend the statute because they were concerned about certain inequities. From about 1945 until 1986, the statute was really never used. In 1986, a few public interest groups had convinced a very conservative Republican senator, Senator Grassley from Ohio, that there was a statute that was on the books that with a little bit of help could be a powerful fraud-fighting weapon. Mm-hmm. And in 1986, the statute was significantly modified to become the powerful weapon that it's become.
Mm-hmm. What are the qui tam provisions?
The qui tam provisions are actually a small part of the statute that has gotten a lot of notoriety after the 1986 amendments. And basically, qui tam is a shorter Latin phrase which means someone who brings a suit in behalf of himself and the king. It basically means a private citizen who comes forward, who has knowledge of fraud, who brings a lawsuit both in behalf of himself and the United States government. The qui tam provisions, the main parts of the qui tam provisions, or qui tam, depending on how you want to pronounce it,
qui tam,
provide for a recovery to the person who comes forward, the whistleblower or the relator, the person who relates information to the government.
And he's called a relator.
He's called a relator. He's called a lot of other things, depending on which side of the road you're on, but he is called a relator under the statute. And if that person comes forward and convinces the government that there is a legitimate case of fraud, then the government will take over the prosecution of the case. And if there is a recovery, the relator will share in that recovery.
In your paper, you mentioned that when they amended the statute in 1986, that it changed the mens rea?
The mens rea.
Requirement from intentional to knowing.
That's correct.
What does that mean?
That is a legalese for saying that for a longest time, and for those of us who defended these cases, defended them rather successfully prior to 1986, you had to prove an intentional act. And in many respects, that was the same requirement as a criminal act. A knowing is that you either knew what you were doing was false, which is one part of the mens rea, or the your mental state when you committed the act, or you recklessly disregarded facts that you should have been aware of. For example, if you're a doctor and you constantly bill Medicare incorrectly, and you're constantly reminded that you're billing Medicare incorrectly, and you fail to take steps to correct that, to refund the money, or to have a billing person in place that knows what he or she is doing, that type of recklessness can now be charged under the Act. And that weakening, if you will, of the mens rea, or the mental state that was required, is what made the statute more powerful to the government.
Now, is it true that that you could no longer use it as a defense that an administrator in the office carelessly used a signature or a stamp?
Very, very difficult to do. It is still raised every single day, and at times when...
I didn't do that. I mean, they made a mistake.
Absolutely. And at times there is a mistake. And quite frankly, if a mistake has occurred, and I know many doctors and physicians get very upset about it, if a legitimate mistake has occurred, I've never seen the government move against that type of an individual. But we're talking about a systemic problem, something that has occurred for a long period of time, and generally...
So a billing clerk's submission of improper bills, whether due to lack of training, supervision, or incompetence, if done over a short period of time, they'd say, well, he wasn't really trained. But if it's done, when you say over a longer period?
Generally, any case I've ever seen is done for years.
So
absolutely.
It couldn't be just a mistake of billing if it goes on for year after year. Then
every single day, people make mistakes, and all they do is call
I
up
have
the
difficulty
government.
in understanding Medicaid regulations. Use that as an excuse.
Absolutely. Or I relied on somebody who I called, and that happens, and what the government generally does is say, okay, refund us the money, and we'll take care of it. And that happens every day.
Refund us the money. Sometimes it's a rather large sum of money, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Yeah.
But no penalties usually assessed for that type of disclosure.
How punitive is the False Claims Act? What are we talking about here?
Well, it probably is one of the most punitive statutes now on the books. Let's take a claim, and the easiest example is that basically a claim is a bill that you submit to Medicare. Let's take Medicare. If you submit a bill for $1 under the statute, you would be required, if convicted under the statute, or of paying the government back $3. That's the first part of the statute.
3 for 1.
That's right.
Yeah.
The second part of the statute, which is probably the most deadly part of the statute, is that in addition to the $3 that you must repay the government, you may also be assessed with a mandatory minimum fine of $5,000 per claim, Bernie, and a maximum of $10,000 per claim.
There's a famous case called the Lorenzo case.
That's right.
It's the United States of America versus Lorenzo. What happened in that case?
Dr. Lorenzo was an area dentist who was performing Medicare screening tests which he claimed and argued were compensable under Medicare. The government indicated that these tests were not compensable and that Dr. Lorenzo knew they were not compensable. And the amount of money that was involved, the out-of-pocket damages in this particular case were relatively low, about $130,000.
These were oral cancer screenings.
Oral cancer screenings. The government went to trial against Dr. Lorenzo, and a judge decided that based on the calculations under the False Claims Act, the court imposed an $18,450,000 fine, plus other costs and interest and they basically took the $130,000, trebled it, then added, and this judge in this particular case was lenient, added $5,000 per claim. So you have a relatively small defalcation, if you will, that ends up with an $18 million judgment.
Okay. So there are over 3,600 claims altogether, and it comes out to $18 million. Now, I don't know where Dr. Lorenzo is going to get that kind of money. You know, when judges make these decisions about 18 million or 25, or you're looking at a guy, maybe if he might have $100,000, $200,000, if he has $1 million, but 18 million, who's got that kind of money?
Absolutely.
Why do they make judgments like that?
Well, the judgment is made for, I don't know what Dr. Lorenzo ended up paying, although I think it was in excess of $1 million.
And I mean, I have no sympathy for the guy who committed this kind of fraud, but when they're talking about judgments, and I see this all the time, and I wonder, where's the money coming from?
The judgment is, the particular reason for the judgment are twofold. Number one, is to collect as much money that the person who's defrauded the system either has or may have. And many times people come into money at a later time. But the more important point is the message that it sends out to the community. Everybody in Philadelphia is aware of the Dr. Lorenzo case, and while the government did not collect the $18 million that the judgment that it obtained, the interim effect, the impact of that particular judgment sent a shockwave into the community. And that causes the self-policing that really the government wants to do. The government can't possibly hunt down every incident of healthcare fraud. They can't do it. But what they hope to do is to get the industry to police itself.
What kind of questions you're looking for from some of my callers tonight? What is it that they could ask you?
Well, the usual question that I get is, what do I do if I am in an organization, a corporation, a hospital, whatever, if faced with fraud? That is the single question that I get day and night. That is a difficult question to answer sometimes because these people often have no place to go.
All right. And so that's the kind of question we're looking for tonight. My guest is Mark Risponti, Esquire, and he's a partner of the firm of Miller, Alfano, and Risponti, PC, and specializing in the cases we're talking about tonight. Our telephone numbers, WWDB contact numbers from Philadelphia, New Jersey, 365-4100, the Pennsylvania suburbs, 664-4100, from Delaware, 234-4100. It's a free call for Comcast, Metrophone, and Bell Atlantic cellular customers. Obviously, you can't mention the name of the organization that you're interested in blowing a whistle on. I mean, that goes without saying. But we can just generally talk about it. And don't mention the town, that you're in, or the doctor is in, or the hospital is in, or whatever. Be very general about this kind of information you're giving us tonight, or the questions you're asking of Mark Risponti. Now this. Yes, Mark Risponti, let's go to the phones in the Center City. And Jane, you're on WWDB. Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say one or two things in defense of physicians.
I don't know why that's necessary. I mean, we think very highly of physicians. We're talking about those who bill for unnecessary office visits or diagnostic tests or prescription drugs. I mean, generally those are the people who rip off the system, and they happen to be in a minority.
All right. Let me say a few words anyway. I also have a degree in epidemiology, which involves a lot of biostatistics, as you may know. And I would like to see the figures broken down, instead of lumping all people who you call doctors in one, break it down into the MDs and the many other people who call themselves doctors, some of whom have been forced upon the medical profession. That is, the medical profession has been forced to accept them, such as the chiropractors, whom many physicians consider nothing.
Now, you object to name calling, but you don't mind calling names of chiropractors, do you?
Well,
why do you make an exception for them, but not for your own group?
Because I think they're quacks, and I don't think the others are.
Well, there are many people who believe they're not quacks.
All right.
Well, let me ask the question to you, Mark.
That's a good question.
Has there been a breakdown of the number of people involved in fraudulent practices, and who are they?
Absolutely. In fairness, let's take the MD if we're going through the food chain.
By the way, I want to say about Jane, it's easy to start calling names. And when you do that, you muddy up the waters. We do have a problem of healthcare fraud in this country. And just because Jane decides she wants to defend all doctors and then take her spite out on another group of people called chiropractors is not going to get the job done.
That's right. That's right.
So go ahead.
The initial cases, Jane, were brought against non-MDs, quite frankly. The chiropractors, the physiatrists, the podiatrists, the durable medical equipment suppliers, actually the so-called second tier, and sometimes the MDs refer to them as second tier, were the first types of cases brought. In the last few years, the government has become more involved in some of the untouchable areas: the cardiologists, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the neurosurgeons. And the reason for that is that their services are often the most expensive and require the largest reimbursements from Medicare. So I think it is across the board, and I don't by any means mean to impugn medical doctors.
All right, let's go to Spring Garden. And Ken, you're on WWDB.
Hi. I have a question for Mr. Responti. If I'm working for an organization and I happen to be aware of certain improprieties, what type of exposure might I have? I mean, is there any possibility of me being charged with complicity of some sort?
The answer is yes. If you are high enough in an organization, and if you are a decision maker in an organization or have knowledge of and complicity in the particular fraud, yes, you could be charged. And if you do have knowledge of those things, and I think I give the same advice to everyone who comes forward, the first thing you ought to do is to come forward within your own organization and go forward to management and tell management that you believe that something is going on. Many of these corporations have put in place excellent corporate compliance programs that are designed to ferret out fraud and to take care of these problems. And I don't know a single corporation that we have dealt with who do not want to nip these problems in the bud. And if you don't get satisfaction from management, and it's a large enough corporation, try and go to corporate counsel. I don't know a single lawyer in the city who advises a healthcare provider who, if they received information of fraud, wouldn't take steps to resolve the problem. But you do have to be concerned when you're too involved in the actual fraud.
Anything else, Ken?
No, that's all. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Holland, and Holland, Pennsylvania. Diane, you're on WWDB with my guest, Mark Responti.
Hi, Bernie.
Hi.
When I go to a doctor, which is not too often, but when I do, and let's say he does 3 things, 3 tests or 1 shot and 2 tests, I give him my card and I walk out the door. I don't even know what the bill is. Not at all. So if I'm supposing that I am like most people, what if there was a paper that we had to sign that said, yes, the doctor did a B12 shot, gave me whatever, 3 things he did. I, the patient, had to sign it and see the cost right there and approve of it by my signature. Would that then help to have those doctors who fraudulently pass on these tests that weren't performed? Would it stop it if we were more accountable? You know, we ask everybody else to be accountable. How about me? How about my 2 parents, which I've just lost in the last 2 years, I spent years with them at the last 2 years at the doctor's offices with, I don't know what they had. I mean, like $150,000 was their hospital bill. And I had no way of knowing what they did to these people, except when I was there in the evening. But I mean, how did my two parents rack up a bill for $150,000 and neither of them had surgery?
Well, 98% of the time, you don't have to worry about it because generally the services that are performed are the proper services that are charged. You raise a very good point, though, and there are several states who are moving toward the type of system that you've suggested. In the past, when doctors or providers have included the charges on there, they've confused the patients, and the patients often want to walk out of there and are not concerned about it. There's a kind of a funny story in our office. My partner had a baby last year and went to a major hospital in the city, a very fine hospital, and he got a $100,000 bill from the hospital. And everything was covered except for $1,000, and the particular hospital was calling and dunning my partner for the $1,000. So my partner called the billing department and asked for a printout on every single thing that his baby had received during that period of time, and started to question $6 for aspirin and $8 for other types of things. And lo and behold, there were no more dunning calls. But it is few and far between where a patient, the recipient of the services, actually will go down and look through every single service to see if what they got is what they paid for.
You know, the problem with that story that you told me is that was it your partner, you said, who put some pressure on this hospital. Now, the hospital backed off because, for a couple of reasons. First of all, they hate for attorneys to go after them. I mean, that's their number one concern. My God, an attorney. The second thing is they felt that since he may have known a few things, he was beginning to become a little nosy, and they decided we best drop, the charges of the extra $1,000. But the problem with that, of course, is there may have been several items on that list that seemed to be extraordinarily expensive and maybe out of line. Am I right?
That's correct.
And that's part of the problem we have in our whole system today.
Right. And in this particular case, it was a private insurer.
Yes,
not a Medicare.
But it's costing all of us money anyway, because
Absolutely.
the insurer is charging higher premiums.
That's correct.
Yeah. Thanks for calling. Back in a moment. Tonight, as Mark Risponti, we're talking about combating healthcare fraud and blowing the whistle on those who commit it. To Center City. Hello, Barbara. You're on WWDB.
Hi. My question to Mr. Risponti was, how has the key temp provision aided the federal government in its combat against fraud, and how does that work?
It's aided it in dollars and cents. Since 1986, when the statute was significantly amended, from the best statistics I've been able to get from the Justice Department, there have been 819 cases filed throughout the United States, and the government has recovered to date $825 million. And of that $825 million, about 10% has gone back to relators in the way of remuneration. So it's been a tremendous boom, and the government sees it as a growth industry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Springfield. Ed, go ahead, please, with Mark Risponti.
Hi, Bernie.
Yes, sir.
I guess I'm so upset. I guess my question to Mark is, us sitting out here, we're looking at the president's health bill, and it frankly scares us. May I compare the two? In other words, I know he's going against insurance fraud, and I'm an insurance man, so I don't like it. Now, isn't the president's bill going to say to the American public, we're losing bundles by this insurance fraud, by the doctors, the physicians, the healthcare providers, and so therefore, Mr. America, you're going to pick up the tab. Is that a fair assessment?
Am I missing the question? Am I missing?
I think I've missed the question. The health care bill, I really don't know what it's going to look like because it's still in committee. But the one point I would make is no matter what bill comes out of the Congress, it is not going to eliminate health care fraud.
No, it won't.
And so
fraud, you know as well as I do that people with bad backs are still going to be able to work. I know they do. And as an insurance man, I see it. I can't allow it for my company or for the insured. But
I don't know, what is it that you cannot allow, Ed?
I think my comparison is, are you going after insurance fraud from the professional, and is the president's bill going to put the bill on the back of the American? In other words, the average citizen is going to have to pick up the bill because you're going to let the fraudulent individual.
Well, okay, let me see if I can help you out, Ed. Thank you. Is it possible that the passage of a national health care bill of universal